So far, we've explained why we have ethics that cover how we approach human subjects in our research. And we've explored how those ethical requirements usually become pertinent around issues of media and privacy. That is quite often when we're thinking about how to approach research subjects. One of our primary concerns has been the way in which we should do research in a method that respects people's right to privacy. But while we're talking about ethics and being responsible in research, I think there's another question that we need to ask. Something that concerns me is that considerations of ethics spend a lot of time thinking about the rights of the people who are in our studies. But I think if we're talking about doing media research that has some kind of social benefit, we need to ask another question. We need to ask about what are our responsibilities to giving visibility to voices, situations, and people who are rarely heard of in the public realm. So I want to suggest that ethics doesn't just come into play in the question of how we treat the subjects in our research topics. It also comes into play when we're thinking about how to ask a research question. What sorts of research questions do we ask, and how do these involve ethical considerations as well? And I suppose we might start off by noting that the UN in 1948 in its founding charter put on record the idea that the right to speak, the right to be heard, the right to record one's presence in the world was a basic human right. And of course, most of us know that there are many abuses of human rights issues around the world, which are exacerbated, made worse, by the fact that we don't know very much about them. So, for example, the issue of gendered violence is a global phenomenon. I believe some time ago, the World Health Organization established gender as the number one risk factor for encountering some kind of violence in the world. And we can see here, um, for example, if we think about the nation of India, we can see that gendered violence is an issue that affects um, that affects many Indian women um, in very great numbers. And we also know that this is an issue that we don't hear very much about. And the reason why I'm highlighting this particular case is for two things. Firstly, we know that gender is a major issue in media research, but more recently, media researchers, and I'm thinking particularly of the media anthropologist Liz Bird, has really urged us to spend more time trying to think about representing media users or media audiences or social groups who we rarely think of. One of the great ethical challenges, according to Liz Bird, is that for media researchers, it's very easy for us to research the media rich, the people who have relatively unfettered access to media technologies, to media content, and who can use those things in all kinds of interesting ways and are very willing to speak to us about the great things that media do in their lives. But we spend far less time talking to people who are perhaps less resourced, less well resourced, and less articulate. And our argument is that the first step toward being ethical is to think about how we can represent the relatively unrepresented in the research that we do. So there's a great deal of questions about whether or not we should spend more time trying to think about how to access the relatively invisible people who live within media worlds. So, for example, one of the things that interests me very much is the intersection of gender and caste in India. So, for example, recently there's been a lot of interest um, in violence directed at members of the Dalit class in areas such as Uttar Pradesh, which is one of the great northern regions of India, and the way that gender and caste intersect to produce particular forms of discrimination, and the problems of getting media to cover those issues. So one of the things that we might ask is, for example, how do social media activists in Uttar Pradesh try and use media to address those sorts of issues? Not a very happy topic, something which is fraught with danger, both for the researcher and the research, but nevertheless a question that we might think that's certainly worthy of asking, but one which doesn't get asked that often. And this gets us thinking about the sorts of audiences that often show up in media research versus the kind of emerging groups that we don't hear about very often, but are really, really interesting. So, for example, older people and social media. So, we know a few things. We know that for many years, there's kind of been this drift towards studying young people in the media. And very often it's based on this kind of ill founded assumption that young people are more interesting when it comes to how they use media and social media in particular. And there's really not much evidence to make the case that that's true. One of the reasons why we might think that young people are more interesting to study is that we spend more time studying young people. And there's all kinds of reasons for thinking that one of the great growth areas is to think about, for example, the use of social media amongst aging populations. One of the things that we know is that aging populations are growing larger in size, and with that, they bring all kinds of hitherto unencountered social challenges. How do we care for large generations of older people? How do we help them look after themselves? And one of the things which is very interesting is in China, for example, there has been research to suggest that older Chinese people are very enthusiastic about engaging with social media. And this becomes an incredibly important way of them fulfilling their family duties and their family obligations and maintaining their family links under changing conditions of greater physical mobility. So the point I'm trying to get to is that another ethical consideration in doing research is not just thinking about how we ethically approach the people who are in our studies, but how we ethically decide who to study in the first place. And another ethical issue is who should drive our research questions. Back in the 1940s, the Austrian sociologist Paul Lazarsfeld famously made a distinction between administrative and critical research, where he said that administrative research is the sort of research that is driven by industrial problems. Media industries present us with a problem and we're there to solve them. But Lazarsfeld didn't think that was the most interesting sort of question to research, even though he spent a lot of time researching those sorts of questions. He did that because media industries paid his bills. But he was very interested in and very keen to point out that there's a really limiting that doing research that's driven by industrial questions. How do I sell this brand? How do I make this particular TV show more popular or whatever? Is a really limited way of doing research, and is actually to focus exclusively on those sorts of questions is really to abandon your responsibility as a scholar. Lazarsfeld was far more interested in asking the bigger questions about how media in general affect the quality of social life, and really thought that the more applied industrial questions were secondary to the duty and the obligation of the media researcher. So, what we're saying is that the question of ethics isn't just a matter of administrative procedures that happen once a research question is asked, but is also really something which should be figured into the considerations of how to ask a research question in the first place. So, another aspect of thinking about research ethics is to ask yourself the question: what is the social benefit of the research that I want to do? How will my research make society a better place?